Starfield has now been out for over 3 months, and I want to use this opportunity to talk about the current state of the game. While the game has received a few updates since launch, they've all been about adding a little polish and squashing bugs. The game may technically be better off than it was at day one, but it doesn't really feel all that different. Part of this is a good thing. Starfield launched in a relatively stable state, especially for an open world RPG. While there have been bugs which have prevented progression, they weren't a universal problem, and for most players, the game launched in a very playable way. And with the updates, it's only become more stable, with a lower chance of encountering bugs and better optimization across the board. But there's not really been any new content, and this is where Starfield is really struggling. Starfield may well be Bethesda's biggest game at launch, with over 12 million people now having played it. But when it comes to people sticking with the game over time, that's really not happening. If we look at this Google Trends chart for search volume of Starfield over the past 4 months, you can clearly see interest peaking in early September, with a strong and steady decline after that. Interest right now is at the same volume as it was a month before launch. And for anyone wondering about the bumps up, those are the weekends. Turns out Starfield is significantly more popular at the weekend. This decline is to be somewhat expected for single-player RPGs. There's always going to be a peak around launch date, and then interest will decrease over time. But what you will see when a game is well regarded, popular, and open to replayability is something like this. You still get the decrease over time, but it doesn't drop down entirely. Less interest than at launch, sure, but still plenty of people interested in the game. For those wondering, this chart is for Baldur's Gate 3, a very popular RPG which launched about a month before Starfield. To be clear, this is a great game, which seemed to do a lot better than the devs expected, and has been a noticeable success. This is very much the ideal sort of situation you can hope for when making a game. The problem is that a lot of players have this kind of ideal situation as their hope for Starfield. This was the first new Bethesda universe in 25 years, their first single-player game since Fallout 4, and a game which they had been working on for 8 years. Starfield got hyped up for a lot of people as the next big thing, and when it launched, they felt let down. Starfield is not a bad game. It really isn't. Overall reviews of it tend to skew towards the positive, and that's even with it managing to get marked as a controversial game. The problem is that the game is just good, when people wanted a game that was great. When you're expecting a 10 out of 10 game and you end up with a 7, it can often feel worse than it actually is. This disappointment in the game is a big reason why interest dropped off so steeply, but it doesn't account for why interest is currently so low. If it was just the people that got disillusioned by the game that left, well, that would still leave plenty of more casual players who don't get wrapped up in the highs and lows of internet arguments. The reason why interest has already dropped so low is, in my opinion, down to a lack of content. It feels a little strange to talk about a lack of content in a game with over 1,000 planets, but that is also where a lot of the problems lie. Apparently Starfield has 1,692 different planets and moons. I've searched around online for the numbers here, and across those planets we have somewhere in the range of 150 generic points of interest, and about 80 odd unique areas, with a quarter of which being actually populated. Averaging it out, and that means there's about 20 empty planets for every planet that has something unique on it. This ratio is what has really led to Starfield's downfall. Bethesda seem to be of the mind that the more is better, always chase for bigger numbers, bigger is better mentality. What actually happened is players realising that most of the game world wasn't worth going to, and they just quickly ran through the areas which were interesting. If you look up Starfield on How Long to Beat, you can see that even a completionist playthrough is considered to only take 147 hours. That's the sort of playthrough where you do everything there is worth doing. For a bit of comparison, Skyrim is typically in the high 100, low 200 range for completionist playthroughs. Starfield is obviously a much bigger game than Skyrim, but in terms of actual content, they're quite a similar size. The main difference is that Skyrim put its content in a map you can walk across in a single unbroken journey, while Starfield tried spreading the same level of content throughout the entire galaxy. This is what has really killed interest in Starfield among fans of the game. While plenty of us have enjoyed our time with it, having to travel all over the place to get from one location to the next is a tiring experience that lowers overall enjoyment. It's hard to stick with a game which throws loading screens up at you constantly as you're travelling around. It's led to a strong feeling of Starfield fatigue among the players who have put in the time. I know that I have no real desire to jump back into the game right now. I've put in a few hundred hours, done all the main quests and the majority of the side stuff, but the idea of searching through this huge game for all the little bits and pieces I've missed out on is just a daunting task, which would not be fun or rewarding to accomplish. The term "as wide as the ocean and as deep as a puddle" is one that has been used in the past to describe many Bethesda games, and in the past, I've strongly disagreed with its use. Bethesda games have always been big, presenting us with a world that you can walk through and a journey you need to take between the major story elements. Honestly, that's been quite an appeal of their games. Rather than going from linear plot point to linear plot point, you instead get to experience the world itself, existing within the wastelands of Fallout or high fantasy of the Elder Scrolls. But when it comes to Starfield, I think the phrase "as wide as the ocean, as deep as a puddle" can be fairly used. While Bethesda have put in just as much content as in previous games, they've spread it paper thin, and the more spread out it is, the less you can feel it's there. After 3 months of playing Starfield, the main thing I wish was different about the game is that I wish it was smaller. Condense the game down to 100 different planets, spread across a dozen systems, and it would all be more bearable. There still could be the realistic empty planets around, but it wouldn't have to feel like you were surrounded by them. And the planets with settlements on them could maybe have more than a single town. The fact that no safe planet which supports life has more than one major settlement makes no logical sense. It's even brought up in one mission, the one where you head to Paradiso and encounter the Generation ship. The resort owners talk about not allowing the new arrivals to settle on the other side of the planet because the resort may want that land in the future. But planets are absolutely huge, and the resort is tiny in comparison. Hell, New Atlantis is the biggest settlement in the entire game, and even it isn't actually that big. Don't think there's really much of a concern about an urban sprawl developing anytime soon on Paradiso. Look, Starfield is a good game, and I say it again because I want people to know that I'm not one of these angry sorts online, screaming and shouting because things didn't work out exactly the way I wanted. I do have more personal problems with the game, such as the whole equipment system and the general morality of the Constellation followers, but those are minor negatives in the grand scheme of the thing. Ultimately, Starfield has fallen short for one reason. Bethesda focused on making a game that could be played forever, rather than on making a game that people would want to play forever. About a month or so before the release of Starfield, I swore off of Skyrim. It was a game that had been a mainstay of my channel, but I had reached a point where there was nothing left for me to do that I hadn't already done a dozen times before. Despite this, many people were asking me to do the same thing again. People were clamouring for me to just churn out near identical content, because Skyrim is a game where people are happy to repeat their actions over and over again, with only minor variations on each playthrough. Skyrim is a game where people want to play it forever, but there are not infinite areas to explore or people to encounter, so Bethesda made a game which would be infinite. They made a game with entire planets you could walk across. It would take more time than any of us will live for to walk across every part of every planet in Starfield. And then there's New Game Plus as well, where you get to do it all again. Starfield seems to have been developed from the ground up to be a game that always has something it tells you to do. But this stretching out of things is precisely what stops it from being a game that we want to play forever. Two key examples in the game of things being stretched out are the Red Mile runs and Dragonstar Force books. These are both repeatable missions that are very straightforward. One is to run through an obstacle course of sorts and press a button. The other is to head to vendors, buy a book, and bring it back. Both are essentially fetch quests at their core, and both will reward you for doing the same mission 30 times over. 30. That's the amount of times Bethesda seem to think people would want to do these missions over the course of a playthrough. While both are certainly worth doing once, maybe even twice, 30 times just feels a little disrespectful. It's a clear example of Bethesda trying to jump up the numbers of hours of content, artificially increasing it by just throwing the same mission over and over again, without them even technically being Radiant quests. We've had plenty of Radiant quests to get on with in Bethesda's past few games, and it's been a good way to balance things out and add a little more playtime that doesn't require unique dialogue or rewards at every turn. But in Starfield it feels like things have been flipped on their head. We have the main content of the game, which I personally quite enjoy and think is pretty good overall, but that is all down to personal preference on how much you enjoy it. But that seems to mostly just exist to convince you to go to new places and explore a bit. The bulk of the game seems to be centred on just getting you to repeat the same generic missions over and over again on new planets, in the hope that you'll not get bored but just keep playing forever. What has actually happened is the opposite. The game has ended up feeling empty overall, and the vast majority of players have left it behind. If Starfield is going to bring back its player base and have the sort of long life that Bethesda clearly designed it for, then there needs to be a lot more content. There will be updates, patches, and DLC in the future, which will all add to the game in some way. If the content added proves to be substantial and worth playing through, then the game may see a consistent increase in average player numbers. But if the feeling of mass emptiness remains in the game, then I could easily see Starfield as a game that is mostly forgotten about in a few years' time. I will say that there is some hope. There's a wide range of examples of games these days with worse launches than Starfield that had a lot of hard work put into them over the years and have now become fairly well respected and even seen as success stories. Hell, Bethesda's own Fallout 76 had one of the worst launches in recent years, but now has a pretty dedicated community and received its latest big free content update earlier this week. Starfield has a chance to make this same sort of turnaround, but I wouldn't expect it to happen anytime soon. I'm already at the point of fatigue with the game, and while there are still a few Starfield videos I want to publish this month, I think you'll all be seeing a channel update before the year is out, where I'll talk about how my content is changing. I had my fingers crossed that Starfield could revive my channel, but that definitely hasn't happened. I only have 2 Starfield related videos which have made it to over 10k views. Both of them were released before Starfield was even out, and one of them is just talking about other sci-fi games you can play while waiting for launch day. Might be worth checking that video out if you've still got a bit of a sci-fi itch left unscratched, so I'll leave a link to it in the description. From what I've seen across YouTube, this is a fairly common thing though. Pretty much the only channels I've seen getting big views on Starfield are those which were already big. While I'm sure there's been the odd breakout here and there, for the most part, when I'm seeing Starfield videos, the views are pretty low. The interest just doesn't seem to be there. You know what, I think I've talked about this for long enough. I'm sure many of you have your own thoughts which you will share in the comments below. Feel free to subscribe if you're curious to see where my channel goes next, and to all of you who listened to the full video, thank you for watching. Sarge out.